Hi, I'm Jess Walter. I'm a local author, and thank you, first of all, for supporting the arts and artists in Spokane right now. It's a tough time for everyone, but for artists especially, I think, to come together like this for the Arts Awards means so much. So thank you, and I'm here to talk about my new novel, The Cold Millions, which comes out this October and is my 9th book, my 7th novel. I'm going to read a little bit from it, but first I'm going to tell you a little bit about The Cold Millions, which I worked on the last few years here in Spokane. It's a Spokane novel. It's set in 1909 during the free speech riots, a time that echoes the period we're in now, with social strife and rioting and the kind of income inequality that I think for a lot of us is one of the biggest issues that we battle today. As I started to work on the book, that was one of the things that drove me, the echoes of the inequality and the battle for fairness and justice that are gripping the country right now. But also, I was driven by writing about Spokane at this period of time, 1909, which for me was one of the most vibrant periods in Spokane history. Looking back at a time when the city was doubling every 6 or 7 years in size, when there were still horses and cars on the road at the same time, when the city was becoming a modern and central place in the country, but was still a sort of rough western town. And this period felt to me like such a great moment to write about, almost like the show Deadwood, if you could imagine 100,000 people living there. So I started writing about 1909 Spokane and settled on these characters, Gig and Rye Dolan, these two brothers, itinerant workers, what we would call homeless now, what they called hobos then, who came by train to Spokane. And the novel also features two other characters that they meet, Ingersoll the Great, who is a vaudeville singer who performs on a stage with a live cougar, and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, a real historical figure who led the free speech riots for the industrial workers of the world, the nascent union at the time that represented everyone, no matter who they were. And the fact that Spokane was the center of these protests just really struck me. The novel also features a bunch of other characters, and I'm going to read just a little bit from one of those characters now. People who come into the story in various ways. And this is one of my favorites, even though he's a bit of a villain. It comes from midway through the book, but his arrival in Spokane is one of my favorites. He's a detective named Del Dalveau. And Dell is a Pinkerton, a private detective hired by the mining companies to rough up union workers and others. And his arrival in Spokane and his arrival in the novel was one of my favorite bits. Dell uses sort of arcane language. He's British, and he uses the sort of 19th century language that Brits used. And so the word that first struck me with him was the word morbs. As I was doing my research, I found out that this was a word that people used to use to describe a sort of morbid mood that they would hit. And so Dell's first line, Spokane gave me the morbs, was almost like meeting that character in person. This is Del Dalveau. Spokane gave me the morbs, right blood blister of a town, 6-month millionaires and skunk hobos and none in between. Spokane, a gilded carriage passing by peasants bathing in the very river they shat in. Last place I wanted to go, but the job was the job, so I packed 3 shirts and I lingered a minute over which barking iron to take. In the end, I went small, loud, and kicky, the .32 Savage automatic. I caught first class Denver to Billings, my first day sober in a month, spent crossing Montana, then 2 hours over the Idaho Panhandle toward the Washington border, and that's when that old morbid voice rattled up. Careful, Dell. At Hope, I slipped the porter $1 for a whiskey, then another when the train slowed the last 5 miles, forest, foothills, farms, and finally Spokane. I couldn't believe how the syphilitic town had metastasized. Smoke seeped from 20,000 chimneys, pillars to an endless gray ceiling. The city was twice the size the last time I'd hated being there. A box of misery spilled over the whole river valley. I was half rats by the time we settled in the train station. That voice again, "Go home, Dell, you don't need this." But my doctor wasn't likely to take my reputation as payment. "You can do this," I said back. 2 years of Pinkerton, 10 more with Allied, and 20 of freelance. I had survived worse. And the money was good. The kind of money I hadn't seen since the mining wars. This Lem brand offering me prime pay. "Dear Detective Dalveau, my associates and I would like to inquire." And it was a bit of my old station in the letter, too. But I also suspected the job lived on the outskirts of what I was willing to do. And I'd done plenty. Undercover with the Molly Maguires in my youth and the Unionists in middle age. I had broke, beat, and buried men. Spokane had a fancy new train station since I'd been through, built on an island just this side of the falls, 3 stories of brick and optimism. On the platform, I made the mistake of looking up, and a ripe ass told me that I was gazing at the biggest clock west of Chicago, 155 feet tall, with 4 9-foot faces. The ripe ass also said Spokane had the biggest beer hall in the world and the biggest theater stage, too, and I fancied shooting him in the teeth if he didn't shut up. I can suffer any fool, but a booster turns my guts. "You know what else you should see while you're here?" he said. "Is it only you," I said, "or is every man in this town an insufferable ass?" Before he could answer, a thick lug and a driver's cap stepped forward from a line of porters. He stared at my nose. A lot of things a man can hide, but not that grog blossom map of life. "Mr. Dalveau," he said, "please follow me, sir." I stepped after the driver, but I noticed his socks were silk. His arm swung cufflinks. Good Christ, this tiresome business. A fancy monger pretending to be his own driver, cap and all, reaching for the bags like a servant. How to play it? Get rambunctious or let him have his fun? I went down the middle. Didn't want him to play me, but I didn't want him canked yet either. "Thank you, Mr. Brand," I said, and he looked surprised over his shoulder. I liked the defeat on his face. His racket was queered, and he'd carried my bags. How's that for a red-nosed muffin guts? He muttered some rot about safety and anonymity, but I could tell he just wanted to reveal himself like some posh magician. "Look, it is I, Lemuel Brand." So that's the Cold Millions. Thank you so much. Thank you for supporting Spokane Arts and for supporting all of these great artists. And I'll see you out on the road in October at Book Tour. Thanks again.